This video is sponsored by Incogni. Hi friends, today we're talking about the zany, wacky melee weapons of the Imperium. From simple bayonets to badass lightning claws, we'll cover them all. And unfortunately, we'll have to save the Xeno weapons for a future date since, well, the Dark Eldar alone would make this video far too long. But anyways, let's fix bayonets and get into the weapons. And, since we just fixed them, let's unfix them and examine and talk about the humble bayonet. Yeah, it's just a bayonet. Literally just a regular bayonet that can be fixed on las guns, bolt guns, and presumably other guns. There's a lot of weapons in 40k that are essentially just real-world weapons, maybe with some material advances or space magic, but the concept's largely the same. That being said though, there are some interesting variations on the bayonet, such as the Space Marines Gears of War style chain bayonets or power bayonets for some extra cut-in power. Which, speaking of chain bayonets, let's talk about one of the most, if not the most iconic melee weapons in all of 40k. Basically, every faction has a variation of this sweet weapon, and it's the closest thing to a default weapon in the setting. It's the chainsword, and the many variations of them. As their name suggests, chain swords are basically chainsaw swords, but contrary to popular belief, they aren't really supposed to cut exactly like a chainsaw does. In most depictions, rather than holding it to an object to cut like a chainsaw, chainswords are usually designed for hacking and slashing. The chain of the chainsword is commonly lined with monomolecular edged teeth, and this in combination with the extreme rotation speed gives the chainsword great cutting power and even allows it to parry power weapons to a certain extent. And beyond the sword, there's chain variations of basically any melee weapon you could think of. Quickfire, we've got the aforementioned chain bayonet, the kick-ass chain axe, chain fists, which are most commonly used by Terminators to breach Space Hulk doors, chain glaives, and my favorite of all, the eviscerator. The eviscerator is also a sword. A sword set to humongo, that is. The eviscerator is basically a chain grade sword, and it might just be the coolest type of sword in 40k. But despite their badassery, chain weapons do have some notable downsides. First off, their teeth are susceptible to breakage and dulling after enough use, which is why it's important to always floss. They can also jam if not well maintained, can be loud, which honestly in the 40k universe can be a pro or a con. But some of the more advanced and sophisticated chain swords, like the Eldar ones, are nearly silent. But the most important downside is that chainswords are basically worse than power weapons in every single way. However, they're cheap and easy to produce, extremely brutal, and effective enough to be an extremely ubiquitous weapon. From the humble guardsman all the way to the massive titans, the chainsword is always a trustworthy killing machine. But before we get any further, there's a lot of fancy wacko weapons in 40k, but there's spooky people in the real world called data brokers, and they don't use badass chain swords or power fists, rather they weaponize your data. But luckily today's sponsor Incogni can help remove your personal data from these data broker sites. Data brokers can use your personal information to carry out scary things like scams, identity theft, and those gosh darn scam likely calls. And there can be hundreds of sites that have your personal information and make it tedious to take down. But luckily, Incogni's got your back and will do all the work needed to take down your data. Best of all, you don't really have to do anything to get this data taken down. Once given permission from you, Incogni goes out and does everything needed to remove your personal information from these data brokers. This saves a lot of time as you don't have to deal with the annoyance of data broker websites intentionally making it a long, arduous process to get your info taken down. Also, if you come across a site before Incogni gets to it, you can use their custom removals feature to send a custom request for them to take care of it. So, what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description, incogni.com/crackduck, and use promo code crackduck to get a 60% off on the annual plan. Another extremely ubiquitous weapon is a simple tried and true regular ass knife. Yep. Turns out that even in the grim darkness of the far future, sharp metal stick is still a very useful weapon and tool. But there's also some pretty badass and notable variations on the simple combat knife. First up, Astartes combat knives are normal combat knives. If you're an 8-foot tall monster man clad in super space armor, that is, these knives are made of hypersteel, which, as the name suggests, is steel but hyper. They have monomolecular edges for extreme cut and power, are super thick and rugged, and are fucking giant. Since they're used by Marines, these knives are big ol' swords to basically anyone else. Which, speaking of giant badass knives, of course the ultra badass space Rambos have some pretty badass knives. Catachan knives are well renowned for their extreme quality and deadliness. Even the orcs will seek Catachan knives because even them humies can make some proper good choppas. That's a little quote I took from an orc. The most iconic of the Catachan knives are the Catachan Fang and the Devil's Claw. The Catachan Fang is basically just a huge high-quality Bowie knife, and the Devil's Claw is an even huger high-quality knife that blurs the line between knife and sword. These crazy knives are usually at least 3 feet long, and in some cases are said to have a mercury-filled channel. This is theoretically meant to give the knife a shifting balance point, but in reality, it would probably be pretty useless, but it does sound cool and sci-fi, and it was also in some old science fantasy, apparently, so, I mean, that's pretty cool, right? But, finally, an even huger knife than any of those huge knives, and possibly the hugest knife, is the Ogryn's appropriately named Huge Knife, which is literally just a huge knife. But then, for something more out there, we've got the power weapons. This weapon class is my favorite, and has got some of the most iconic and badass weapons in the entire setting. There are tons of different power weapons, but almost all of them function relatively the same way. Basically, they're regular melee weapons with a little doodad that creates an energy field around the weapon. This disruption field disrupts solid matter and makes it easy to cut or destroy basically any solid armor, which is very useful in a setting where it seems like everyone and their mom has near impervious super armor or is extraordinarily tough. The most common power weapon is the power sword, which is basically 40k's lightsaber. Other than 40k's literal lightsaber, the Solix Aegis energy blade, of course. But anyways, super obscure weapons aside, the power sword is basically a cool glowy sword that could cut through almost anything. And similar to the sword are the power axes and power glaives. Again, basically the regular weapon that uses a disruption field to help it cut better. Similarly, the Custodian's iconic Guardian Spears are essentially power glaives with a bolter strapped on it for when the thing you want to kill is out of slashing range. They also have the Sentinel Blade, which is a power sword, also with the gun on it, which also, the magazines being the crossguard is both the dumbest and coolest thing ever. I absolutely love it. Then, perhaps the coolest power weapon, we have the Power Fist or Power Glove if you're feeling nostalgic. These are meant for punching and tearing rather than the swords cutting and stabbing. In addition to the disruption field, Power Fist also enhance the user's strength for even better punches. This is the signature weapon of the Terminator since it makes light work of Space Hulk doors and basically anything else as one of the most devastating anti-tank infantry weapons. Also, fun little tidbit, my Cadian Castellan killed 2 Deathwing Terminator Knights with his little power fist. It was really cool. But moving on, some other blunt power weapons are the Power Maul, the Crozius Arcanums, and the Thunder Hammer, baby! Whoa! These mostly do what you think, but some notable things are that the Croziuses are usually used by chaplains and are adorned with cute little symbols to help inspire their battle brothers. They can also sometimes project a power field to enhance its range, but this isn't a very common feature. Then, the Thunder Hammer is perhaps the most powerful infantry melee weapon. It has similar destructive capabilities as a Power Fist, but you can put even more power behind it thanks to the magic of leverage. But a notable drawback of the Thunder Hammer and Power Fist is that they're quite heavy and unwieldy, so even with the strength boost, the user is often slower and less precise than if they're using something like a Power Sword. But even with that, these are still extremely devastating weapons. For these blunt weapons, rather than cutting through armor, the disruption field usually cracks the armor, and then the fist or hammer or whatever else inflicts huge blunt force trauma, assuming the initial blow didn't already atomize the target. But finally, for my favorite of the power weapons, we have the Lightning Claws. These are a bit of an in-between of the power fist and power swords, as you can have dual gauntlets with powered up Wolverine claws. It's badass. And it can even be more Freddy Krueger-esque with powered talons. And to close off this section, there's also Power Brass Knuckles, and they have the best name possibly in the setting. These crazy little things are called Jaw Snapper Knuckle Dusters. Holy shit. Similar to power weapons, though, we have the signature weapon of the Sicarian Ruststalkers, the transonic weapons. These are similar to power weapons, but instead of using disruption fields, they utilize sonic fields and bad vibrations to enhance their cutting power. They're basically humongo ultrasonic cutters. Ultrasonic cutters, if you will. The most common variation of transonic weapons are the blades and cord claws. The blades are pretty intuitive to understand, but the cord claw utilizes vibrations to help the user rip out chunks of flesh and armor from their enemies. And then another weapon pretty closely tied to the AdMech are shock weapons. These are various weapons fitted with power generators that electrify the weapon and, well, shock the enemy. Shocking, I know. The most common variations of these are electro flails, shock mauls, and electro goads. Speaking of goads, another weapon is a goad lance, which will be perfect to segue to all the various lances that the Imperium uses. The most prominent are the aforementioned goad lance, and the others are the hunting lances most commonly used by Rough Riders. And those Attillans know that it's all about the tip, as hunting lances can be fitted with a bunch of different tips depending on the user's needs. There's Melta lances, crack lances, frag lances, plasma lances, poison lances, shock lances, inferno lances, and so on and so forth. And then finally, we have one of the most unique melee weapons, if not the most unique melee weapons in 40k, the Force Weapons. Force Weapons are a class of melee weapons that are designed to channel psyker energies into themselves in order to enhance their effectiveness. These are again similar to power weapons, but rather than disruption fields, they have psyconvectors woven into the weapon in order to channel the user's psyker powers for devastating attacks. This also means that the stronger the psyker is, the stronger the weapon is. And in the hands of a non-psyker, force weapons are essentially regular weapons. And a notable variation of this weapon are the Nemesis force weapons used by the Grey Knights. Nemesis weapons are specifically designed to fight demons and other warp entities, as is the Grey Knight's MO. But let's close this off with the strongest, the most intimidating melee weapon in the entire Imperium, and dare I say the entire setting. And that would of course be the fist of the average Catachan. Let's go, typical guard W, baby! Let's go, guard! It's all about the guard! Woo! But yeah, those are the melee weapons of the Imperium. Very cool stuff. If you want to learn more about the ranged weapons of the Imperium, be sure to check out my older video on them, and stay tuned for future videos on Xeno weapons. Anyways, let me know what your favorite melee weapon in 40k is, and let me know if I didn't go in depth enough on your favorite one, or I missed one, or whatever. And again, big thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Be sure to click the link in the description, incogni.com/crackduck, and use the promo code crackduck to get 60% off on the annual plan. Anyways, thank you for watching, and a special thank you to all the patrons who help support the channel. You're all very epic, and I really appreciate it. As always, please like, comment, subscribe, and consider sharing to all your Imperial melee weapons. Thanks. And GW rolling like half of the power weapons in the same profile is such a dumb lame-o thing to do. Come on, man, I want more power axes.